The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
Deep right, we got tanks up there. Let's follow a range on deep right. I'm being out right on the target right now. I've got a 7 right in front of me. I'm going out for it. Right, I got him.
Welcome back to the Lead Pursuit Podcast. Normally, this podcast talks about all the cool things in aviation. That's right. We talk about fighter guys. We talk about attack guys. But tonight, we're going to deviate from that. I realize that I'm one of those guys that has had a different career. I've spent a lot of time out of the fighter cockpit and around the rest of marine aviation. So tonight, we're going to talk to a very good friend of mine, Isaac Lee, call sign Whiskey. How you doing tonight?
Hey, great. Thank you for having me on the show. It'll be fun to talk about some helicopters, dirty assault sport stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as I was going through and thinking, how was I going to introduce you? I'm like, I can't insult him in the first 5 minutes. So I have to be somewhat nice to my helicopter brothers and sisters. So,
yeah.
But no, it's good to talk about assault sport missions, helicopters, and shameless plug, your book.
Thank you.
So we'll get to Hangar 4 here in a second.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And talk about that because, you know, I get a kick out of reading books written by people that I know. And thankfully, this was one that my name was not mentioned in. So thank you for not putting me in it. I don't have anything that I feel I have to defend to the rest of my family of, you know, what I did or did not do while I was on deployment.
That's perfect.
Yeah, it's one of those funny things. But let's talk a little bit about your background. So you obviously, according to the book, from knowing you grew up in West Texas, you know, high school athlete, come from a definitely a high achieving background where a lot was expected of you.
Yes.
How did you fall into, I think is the best way to describe it, deciding to be a marine aviator? Because I think that's a fascinating, just quick story. A lot of us knew we were going to do it for a while. And then some people woke up one day and were like, that's a really cool airplane. I think I should fly that.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it went for me. I mean, my whole life growing up, my dad was a coach, so I was supposed to be an athlete, and I was, and I didn't really have a plan outside of that, to be honest with you. Thankfully, I was a decent student. So when I was in college, which I went to college because, again, I thought I was supposed to, not because I really wanted to be there or
Exactly.
I was in love with anything I was studying. But I got to a point in college at the end of my junior year where I was like, what am I doing? I don't like this. This sucks. So I go out to my parents' house one night. My dad's sitting in the driveway. I essentially start telling him that same thing. He gets annoyed fairly,
as I can understand.
Yeah. And but from my parents' house, you could see the landing pattern at what was then Reese Air Force Base. It was a training base, so there's T-37s and T-38s in the pattern over there. You know, it was nighttime, but you could still see the lights and everything. So he got to a point in conversation where he just said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I literally just looked at those airplanes and said, I think I'm going to do that, be a pilot in the military. And up to that point, I'd considered the military a little bit, but not seriously. And when I said that, I frankly knew almost nothing about it. He looked at me like I was crazy. And then he just got up and went in the house. He didn't say anything else. He didn't say, you can't do that or you're crazy. He just looked at me like I was a total moron and got up and went in the house. But it was really in that moment that I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to figure this out. And I just was hell-bent from that moment forward. I was like, I'm going to be a pilot in the military. And I literally barely knew what that meant. But sure enough, I figured it out.
Yeah. So obviously you go to Quantico, like a lot, go through OCS, get commissioned as a second lieutenant, and then going through flight school, picking CH-53 Echoes. Why the biggest, ugliest, smelliest, noisiest helicopter in marine aviation? What were you thinking?
Oh, I'll tell you how that happened was what I really wanted was just to come to the West Coast. I was kind of enamored.
I seem to remember that too.
Yeah, I was enamored going with San Diego or going to San Diego. So Cobras sounded cool and 53s sounded kind of cool just because I felt like the aircraft was huge. It was interesting. And I liked the idea of flying with a crew. That was honestly about as much thought as I put into it. So I was like, I'll be happy with either of those in the West Coast, put them down, got 53s West and everything else just kind of happened the way it unfolded from there.
Nice. Yeah, I laugh because I think everybody wanted to be a West Coast Marine aviator.
Yeah.
And sadly, the quality spread. There were those of us that weren't top of the class, weren't bottom of the class, and that guaranteed we were East Coast aviators. So, yeah, I laughed when I read that. But hearing you talk about Miramar, obviously we're a historical podcast, and reading the book, it brought up one of the things that I always remind people is that we read sources, first-person sources from people who were there, and we think of it as the ground truth. What this person wrote is exactly how it happened. And as I'm sitting here flipping through your discussion about Miramar, I am laughing because it is the exact opposite perspective of mine for Miramar. Even though I wanted to be a West Coast guy, I was a few years ahead of you. So I had been to Miramar in the transition when the Navy had stopped spending money on it, and it had gone from being this gorgeous base to being this dump. And then you, fortunately, come along after the Marine Corps taking over and goes, holy crap, the Navy gave us a dump, dropped like $250 million or something into it and made it a nice base again. And it's so funny because as soon as I was reading through there and you're like, yeah, you seem to think it's a really nice place. I'm like, are we talking about the same Miramar? The same Miramar where I'd go in the 7-day store and go, I don't even see any candy bars. What am I going to get in here? Yeah. So it's interesting, at least in the Marine Corps, how a few years difference it can mean anything is because when I was there, all the helicopters were at Tustin. Some had transitioned to El Toro as Tustin was being closed, and then they were transitioning to Miramar. So everything was like living out of your suitcase if you were on the West Coast, as I was for 101 for VMFA 101. So it's just funny to read your book and go, that's not my Miramar. It wasn't like that. And then I have to remind myself that's just a few years later after the Marine Corps cared about it. But anyway, let's dive into the book itself. So Hangar 4, why Hangar 4, Whiskey? Why the title?
So Hangar 4 was then and still is now home to the West Coast CH-53 squadrons at Miramar. So, like any other flight line, the hangars are literally numbered 0 through whatever. And we were 4 right there in the middle of flight line next to the tower. I didn't give that any thought early in my career, but by the second and third time I checked back into that hangar to join one of the squadrons, it just kind of felt like home. Yeah. So as I was putting this whole story together, Hangar 4 to me, it was like, wow, it's this central place that the story keeps coming back to. So the title kind of came up with itself, for lack of a better way to put it. Well, and you're absolutely right, because for my career, I spent all of my squadron flying tours on the East Coast, and all except one time were out of the same hangar, Hangar 418, far side of Beaufort. I might have been on the left side, or the east side, or the west side. It varied which side of the hangar we were in based on deployment rotations, but it was always the same damn hangar that you went home to. And you came back from Mots 1 and you went to the same hangar again, and you checked in to the same squadron spaces. So that's one of those fascinating things about marine aviation and how small it is that I think a lot of people don't always appreciate. There's very much a homesteading kind of feeling that when you get to spend multiple tours on a coast, same base, it's going back home, and you go back to your squadron, or even if you go to one of your sister squadrons, odds are people have moved as well with you. And so you might check in with 2 of your squadron mates and some friends from another squadron, and you make it what it is. Absolutely. And guys also had a tendency to just stay on whatever coast they started on. That was another observation. I mean, there certainly were some who would bounce back and forth, but a lot of us, wherever we started, we would kind of keep going back to those same places. Yeah. So it felt really familiar, the second and third time for sure that I was there. And that was my story as well, because my third time going back to the fleet, after Mots 1, after we were out at Mots 1 together, I mean, I could have gone anywhere I wanted. I was a Mots 1 instructor. And where did I go? Right back to old home, back to Hangar 418 on the west side of MCAS Beaufort, because that's what I knew, and those were my friends. And, that was where I felt opportunity was. So, it was just funny. As soon as when you announced the book and it's Hangar 4, I just had to laugh. I'm like, no, I won't title my book Hangar 418 and copy you. We're not going to do that. But it is funny. And so I have to say, I thank you for letting me get one of your autographed books. Of course. I actually have to read something just so people will enjoy it. Dear Eddie, thanks for being one of the 4 jet guys who actually talk to us helicopter people. While you are not as cool as Boyle Lewis or Taurus Harris or Gecko Hawkins, you can ride in the back of our 53 at any time.
Okay, that's not at all what you said in the inscription, but
I wish I had said that. That's way better.
No, it's one of those funny things that that as I was working out this afternoon, I'm like, I got to say something funny. I gotta say something about how Mott's 1 was, But that's one of the things I want to talk about tonight is how marine aviation is really different than a lot of services, because as we train together, and as the book talks about doing exercises like Desert Talon, ITXs, Mojave Viper, all those things, you've got jet crews, you've got helicopter crews, you have ground Marines, you have support Marines, you have all these different parts of the Marine Corps all living and working together very closely and putting the whole package together. And it's so unique how task organized it is in the military.
It is. And it is because the Marine Corps aviation is so small. Again, even outside your community, you start getting to know people. You run across the same guys over and over. You're at the same exercises. And so the whole thing just develops this real familiarity for you very quickly. It's really a community, like a real community of people.
Yeah, it is. And I've told people that one of the things that made at least us in the Marine Corps so effective was, even if we didn't know the first thing about the area of operations we're going to, even if we were playing a pickup game with squadrons joining and a different ground force that we're supporting, odds are you knew a few people after a few years in the Marine Corps. And so you could walk into the planning cell and go, oh, I know a couple of these guys. It's not, it gives you a little bit of comfort that, all right, we're going to figure this out. We're going to work our way through it. And I think that's one of the keys that makes marine aviation so special. But at least in my opinion, of course, an arrogant WTI instructor opinion, one of the reasons marine aviation is so effective is because of the WTIs. Yeah. And reading about that in your book, I had a horrible flashback. It was one of those moments where I realized whiskey and I have more things in common than I realize. And it's the moment you describe being a young aviator and asking one of your squadron WTIs, basically, how do I be like you?
Yeah.
And just relate that story a little bit here for everyone else.
So I barely knew what WTI was when I got to the fleet. And it was really just because I had a mentor in flight school that used to talk about it all the time. And he was a great guy. I really looked up to him. But so I had this smidgen of understanding that meant like you were the best of the best if you got to go to that school. That's basically as much as I understood. So of course, my mission in life as I'm checking in as my first squadron is like, I want to grow up and be that guy. Like, why would that not be your goal?
Right. Exactly.
And immediately as I'm checking in, run into Jay Spooner Holterman, who ended up becoming a very well-known 53 pilot. It was a few years ahead of me. He was literally checking back in from WTI, like he had just done this thing that was like this huge goal to me. So I started chatting him up and, hey, how'd you get to do that? And, he was very nice about it, but, he should have just told me to shut up and bounce in and,
exactly.
Go be a schedule writer like I should have. But it was just like this thing right away. I was like, that was what I was aspiring to be. It was this goal I had for myself from day one. So it was just this fun thing I was chasing from the very beginning.
Yeah, I had to laugh because my story was we were actually all out on a squadron dinner, literally a booze cruise. We're out in the Beaufort River there on a boat, having a good time with the wives and girlfriends, and a crew had just come back from WTI. And I will never forget walking up to the Wizzo, to Wiz Mayer, and saying, how do I get ready to go to WTI? And he literally looked at me and he's like, how about you concentrate on not sucking in your next couple flights? Got it, Wiz. Absolutely. I'm on top of that, But very much I remember walking in the squadron going, those are the guys I want to be. I want to be those guys that have the right answer, that know, how to do things in the aircraft and are respected because they've got their stuff wired.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of funny to see people that I know as fellow instructors that, oh God, we were all morons at one point, weren't we? Yes.
Oh, totally.
Yes, we
Yeah, totally. But I really looked up to those guys. I mean, the analogy I use is they were like the quarterback of the football team. Like they were the guy. Those captain WTIs, that's who they were. And we all looked at them that way. So, that was just a goal I had from the very beginning is, okay, I want to be one of those guys. Like, how do I get to that?
How do I get there? And I'm sure you probably had similar moments in your career where you're working through qualifications like anybody is. And you're like, how am I ever going to get to WTI? I've got these 15 other quals I have to get before I get there, and then one day you wake up and you're like, oh crap, they just handed me the binder that says start your prep for WTI.
it's a long road. I mean, those first few years in the fleet, like all I did was study, like studied and flew and did my ground job. But, I mean, that's basically your life.
And so that's exactly what I want to anchor down on, because I think so many people, as we talk about fighter aviation or just jet aviation in general, they assume, it's just like Top Gun. You know, Goose and Maverick are always studying in the books. Like, helicopter guys have nothing to study. And I'm like, are you kidding me? That aircraft is infinitely more complex than mine. Mine, you dump kerosene in, light it on fire, and it goes fast. Theirs has all these whirling blades and gearboxes and things that can go wrong. So for you as a young helicopter pilot, and you allude to it in the book, systems knowledge was everything for you.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that. How did you get to be so immersed in systems knowledge for the aircraft?
Well, so in the very beginning, I was really aware of that. And so you get the basics in flight school, right? But those are pretty simple aircraft. And then selecting the 53, I would say for my one pause of regret very early was like, damn, I have to learn all the systems on this thing. You know, this thing's huge and complicated. Like, what was I thinking? So I dove into it at the FRS, and I always was historically like a super nerd and a very good student. So I would just study. But even getting through the FRS, I still didn't feel like I knew it as well as I needed to know it.
Right.
So when I got to the fleet, I did the classic lieutenant move, went to flight line. Hey, you know, what do I got to do to get one of you crew chiefs to know what's going on to do some walk arounds with me? And they, in my case, is so interesting. They were like, no, you need to go to AVI and ask for Warrant Officer Pfeiffer. And I was like, I thought they were playing a trick on me. So I go down to AVI,
Exactly.
waiting to get stacked whatever.
I'm going to get duct taped to something here.
Yeah. But as it turns out, our avionics officer was this guy, John Pfeiffer, and he was a warrant officer who had grown up as an avionicsman and a homegrown crew chief in the 53. And so, you know, knowing right away he's an avionicsman, he's got to be pretty smart. And this guy knew the aircraft like nobody I've ever known before or since. And he was just nice enough to start doing walkarounds with me. And I would go out there anytime I had time. I would go grab a cranial and some rags and go find Pfeiffer, and we'd go climb around on the aircraft. And that's really where I learned it was hands-on, helping him do a daily, helping him do a turnaround, jotting down notes when I could. And that really got me to a place where I was like, okay, now I really understand this machine, which was a huge help in helping me fly the damn thing, because having that intimate knowledge of the systems, you just knew like, okay, this isn't really a problem. That's not really a problem. Knock on the gauge and keep going. Or, oh, wait, this is an early indication of this is a real problem.
This is going to go bad here shortly. Yeah.
This one we actually need to do something about. So let's do this. But it was great.
Yeah. I think that was an interesting perspective for me to read, because it's always kind of mystery to us jet guys. Yes, our airplane is complex. Yes, I get it. We've got digital flight controls, all these other things. But I will never forget being a forward air, or actually being a staff officer in Kandahar and watching squadrons assemble CH-53s after they'd been flown in there on Antonovs, and watching rotor heads put on and tail booms turned and all this stuff that is the most unnatural thing for me. Yeah. As someone who's come from a jet community where I fold the wings, I yank actuators out, I might put something on jacks and change out the landing gear. It's not that same level of complexity. And then watching how many times you guys would go test aircraft, and you'd go out, you'd fly it, you'd come back and you'd work on it, and you'd go out and fly it. And it was this continual tuning of this finely balanced machine that, you know, I think I was probably 2/3 of the way through my career, I had a sudden realization of, I think my NATOPS is complex. Our training and standardization and procedures book, I'm like, I don't even want to know what a 53 NATOPS is like. I'm glad I didn't have to memorize those things.
It was insane. I did also become a functional test pilot early in my career, which helped more. And I love doing those test flights, because it was a built-in excuse to spend all damn day out on the plane with the crew chiefs. And most of the time, you're just kind of BSing with each other, but you learn the aircraft, you get to fly it after, you really get even more intimate with the systems, which I really enjoyed that. That was probably my all-time favorite qual outside of WTI. I loved being a test pilot. It was fun. Well,
I think one of the commonalities between jet aviation and helicopter aviation is when you're that functional check pilot, or in my case, FCF Wizzo. Yeah, there are 4 switches in the back that I have to flip on FCF. But when you do that, you build a bond with those enlisted maintenance Marines, with your maintenance officers that are out there, because there's things that you get a very frank brief when they hand you the book and they're like, here's what we've worked on. Here's the things that are still, they're fixed. We've made the airplane up, but hey, go check this out. And if it doesn't work, bring it back. We'll troubleshoot it some more. But I'm sure you had, like we did, I know you wrote about a couple of them, long-term down aircraft that you pick up that aircraft and you're like, I just want to get halfway through the checklist today in this flight. You know, I don't want to go down in the chocks. I don't want to shut this airplane down and have to hand it back to maintenance, not even having taken it airborne.
Yeah, those were challenging. But you're right, too. That relationship you develop with the Marines downstairs, that lasted for the rest of my career with me. And I worked down there with them for a few years, too, as a junior captain. But I got to the point where even as a field grade, when I came back as a major, I had a good rapport with those guys, and I was so comfortable, maybe too comfortable, to the point where they would always give me that aircraft that was a pain in their butt because they knew like odds were pretty good. I was going to get
you're going to bring
chocks.
it out. Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
I was always like, yeah, give me the one that has the quirks. I'll fly it. It's fine.
Yeah.
So, I enjoyed that.
There's something to be said about that because we're going to talk about morale here in a second. And that when you have that trust between a maintenance department and an aviator or a crew, that things are going to work out, and there's not going to necessarily be this officer enlisted relationship of, hey, give me my airplane, let me take my race car, go break it, come back, you guys fix it, I'll see you tomorrow. Which I've served with aviators that are that way. We all have. But when you build a bond with those Marines in marine aviation, at least in my experience, everything is amazing. You walk to airplanes that are ready to go. And if there's a problem, they tell you early. They're like, sir, if you get out of the chocks today, I'll buy you a beer.
Totally.
Things like that. And it's that relationship that I saw in F-18s in combat, specifically with my ordnancemen. And it was such an interesting relationship because they wanted us to come back with nothing on the airplane. And, you know, my goal was in combat operations, I'm coming back with no ordnance on the aircraft. I'm going to get rid of it all. But there were also times that you'd get out of that airplane and they'd be like, hey, sir, was that a great mission? You didn't bring anything back. And you're like, yep, I got a really angry mud hut and I flattened it. Not the right mud hut, but I flattened that mud hut, you know. And you'd have to admit that, okay, I made a mistake. You guys did great. The weapons came off right. They fused right. You did everything right. But I'm not going to bullshit you. I wasn't at the top of my game today, you know. And that give and take with the maintenance crews, for me, that was priceless. And I know you guys had a lot of the same things going on.
Yeah, for sure. I love those relationships, and those Marines downstairs were always, I don't want to say my favorites. You're not supposed to have favorites, but I spent a lot of time with those guys. They were great. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. I feel bad, at least for my career, because I spent so much time in ops and over in the headquarters side and a little bit of time in maintenance as a QAO. So I only got to be the bad guy. I never got to be the good guy. They was like, oh shit, there's Captain Glover. Yeah, I'm here to yell at somebody. So that's quality
funny.
assurance is that way. Someone has to be the bad guy.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about squadron morale and building that kind of esprit de corps, because it's something that we take seriously as Marine officers. And we generally, in the units that we work in, we take seriously the team inside the unit and how we make people work hard, play hard, and come out as good Marines. I did laugh, and I didn't do it intentionally when I got your book and I put it up in the bookshelf. When I went and stuck it in the bookshelf, I looked at what was sitting right next to it. I stuck it right next to the Marine Officer's Guide. I'm like, okay, Whiskey's not that cool. He doesn't get that spot. I'm going to put him over here with the rest of the history books.
Yeah.
But it's a point that reading a book like this reminds me of all the things that were imbued in us years ago at OCS, at the Naval Academy, at TBS, in your first squadrons, about morale is everything. That if you don't have a unit that has cohesion, you're never going to be a top achiever. And if you are, you're going to do it on the backs of those Marines, and you're going to do it at the expense of your junior officers. And that's not the way to lead. But you hit on at least officer morale real well in your first discussions about going on Western Pacific deployments and talking about the echo chamber, and the SCAR bar. So let's talk a little bit about deployed officer dynamics. Because I think it's something that always gets glossed over, It
is. And one of the things I really tried to do in the book, and I stuck to it, was no revisionist history. And
Thank you.
I kept a journal throughout the time I was in the Marine Corps. So I'd written all this stuff down. So I really wanted to give an honest perspective of, hey, if this is what First Lieutenant Lee thought the world looked like in 2000, say it that way. Like it is, even though at this point in my life, some of that was kind of cringy. I was like, man, I'm kind of telling on myself here and this sucks. But that's how it looked. So it was honest, right? But that first deployment, it just felt like this huge adventure. We get to Okinawa, which there's nothing special about the barracks in Okinawa, but there's these 2 bars in these barracks. And they're really nothing more than a common area lounge that the squadrons had taken over and turned into their little bars. So 53 guys, we had the echo chamber, reference ping, 53 echo. And then the skid guys, Cobras and Hueys, had the SCAR bar. And we both thought about those as squad. Like it was hammered home to me immediately by the senior captains that this was the most important room on the planet. We were never supposed to let anyone defile it. Don't let any other squadrons in here, all of that stuff. But the truth is, to me, like I was enamored with just being in there and really listening to the senior captains, the majors. Like it was a free education every night. And we were drinking way too many 50-cent beers and, rocking the stereo, but it was just like every night was like a free lesson, a free flight, because they were always telling stories and often I had this emergency, we did this. I mean, it was just endless education that was just flowing in there, and morale, and it's Marines. So most of the time we'd start antagonizing each other. There's a lot of banter back and forth, guys giving each other a really hard time. Occasionally something resembling a fist fight would break out, but
no, say it isn't so.
At the end of the night, it was usually, a bunch of pilots had too much to drink, hugging it out and making their way back to their rooms. And then we'd do it again the next weekend. It was great. Like it was great.
But I think, at least in my experience, and we had similar things up in Iwakuni for the fighter squadrons that rotated through there. As one of my good friends called the unit deployment program to the Western Pacific, he called it college with airplanes, which is pretty much what it was for most of us. But there was, you're right, you learned a lot. And we didn't, on my first tour, we didn't have a squadron bar in the BOQ, but we were right next to the O Club. Yeah. And so you would spend, as a deployed squadron, a lot of time in the O Club. And for me as a junior guy, you're hearing a lot of sea stories, a lot of, well, there I was when the airplane did whatever. Yeah. And especially for us, because the F-18D was still relatively new, we had a lot of transitions. So we had A6 crews, we had OV-10 crews, F4 crews that had all come into this F-18 two-seat regime. And so we got all kinds of crazy stories from other airplanes where, A6 guys were like, I was when, both engines quit,
Yeah,
like, what'd you do?
Really cool.
We deployed the Rat, and it powered our systems, all these different things. And you're right, it was a free education. And I think a lot of times in the military or in non-military circles, they forget the reason the military has these kind of things is not just for camaraderie, but it's a way to break down some of the barriers. That if you're afraid to go ask someone who's your superior or your instructor or whoever, tell me how to do something, when you're all in a common morale kind of situation, those barriers, a lot of them are gone.
Yeah, that's a great point. And honestly, I never thought of it that way, but that's 100% accurate. I mean, the information's free flowing. Everyone's got their guard down a little bit. I mean, they're still giving you a hard time if you're a junior guy for being a junior guy, but it was good. Yeah. I mean,
I was the butt of much of that abuse, but to be able to sit there and listen to senior guys that would never admit a fault in front of me, but as we're all sitting there drinking beers, they'd tell a story about how they nearly screwed it up, and thank goodness they remembered this procedure or the system worked this way, and that's how I learned a lot.
Yeah, same. It was just, I always thought of it as time well spent. And I had, most of my peers at the time, I was one of the only married guys. And so a lot of my peers were like, oh, let's go to the bars and let's go down to Gate 2 Street. And I was like, well, I don't
know what you're talking about. Gate 2 Street? That's a thing. Never heard of it.
I was like, I'll go and drink 50-cent Coors Lights and listen to these senior guys tell stories. Like, it's cheaper and I'll learn more. So see you guys later, So that's mostly what I did.
That's how you avoided all the trouble of Okinawa. I think I seem to remember. Oh yeah. All that dangerous time. Well, so let's take that discussion of building morale, and let's then take it to the next couple chapters of the book where you're now in combat and you're now going through Iraqi Freedom 1, the push up to Baghdad, and then recurring deployments to Iraq. I think, and you allude to it a little bit, that the formation of a squadron or of friendships in that kind of free flowing, no barriers kind of background, talking basically about the echo chamber, that then is something you rely on later when you're in combat, because you don't have the time to have those discussions there. Everything is go, go, go. Everything is reacting, and you're now falling back on some innate knowledge that hopefully an old guy passed you. And at the same time, some of these people are the ones you're flying with, and you have to trust them explicitly.
Yep. Yeah, it was super helpful to have that foundation, and I was fortunate to be in a squadron that was very tight, or at least to me, it felt like it was a very tight group of people. So when we went to OIF the first time, and it was interesting because it started evolving as OIF evolved. But that first time we went, we didn't have anyone in the squadron with any combat experience. Our CO had been like a lieutenant in Desert Storm and flew around Kuwait a little bit. That was it. So it was new to everybody at every level. Obviously, there were guys who were more experienced, had more quals, et cetera. But the literal combat piece was all new. So kind of diving into that with a group of people that you really trusted was critical, I think, for sure. It helped us a ton. Yeah.
Well, so when you found yourself in a lot of these, I'll call them unknown situations, because that's the best way to describe combat. You may have planned something, but the enemy gets a vote. The weather gets a vote. All these things that can go wrong will go wrong. How did the crews react? You over the discussion of a couple deployments, you talk about some very different reactions to combat experiences, to near-death experiences, to highly stressful situations. Kind of take us from the best reactions you saw to what the lowest were, because Marine units are like any unit. They're made up of human beings. Not everyone is going to react well in combat, regardless of how heroic we talk our service being. There are people that have bad days.
Yes. Well, I would say I didn't really totally recognize this until a little bit later, because my first deployment I was just doing, or my first combat deployment, I was just doing it. I was executing. I wasn't really thinking at all about what effect is this having on me? What am I thinking? There were a couple of moments where I was like, oh, wow, that was really exciting. I probably shouldn't think that was exciting. That probably should have freaked me out. But I didn't really have time to really think about any of that. But later, as I did it more and more, kind of the conclusion that I personally came to was in the squadron, and using the pilots themselves as an example, or the flyers, the air crews. Let's say you had 30 pilots, and over multiple deployments, what I recognized was 2 or 3 of those guys seemed to really thrive in that environment and actually be appearing to enjoy it. Like they liked it. And then 1 or 2 on the opposite end of the spectrum would just discover they just couldn't do it. Like it was too much, right? Yep. So they just would vote and say, hey, I'm sorry, I can't do this. It's too much. Yep. And the rest of call it 90, 95% of the squadron in the middle, I felt like they were just really good people that had great training, and they had the fortitude to do it. But they weren't like the weird ones that liked it. They could execute it.
I feel like I'm being called out here, Whiskey.
Yeah. And so I started recognizing that it's always these 2 or 3 people that seem to really thrive and are enjoying this. And not surprisingly, by the time I got to WTI, I was looking around and I was like,
it's all the same people.
It's a whole group of those guys. And that's not an accident, I don't think. Just some people are just wired that way for whatever reason, that they really thrive in that environment. And, that comes with a lot of strings attached. But I do believe that's true. Yeah.
And I think the book does a great job of, without beating people over the head with it, saying, hey, playing at the top of your game is not without consequences.
Oh yeah.
And it's not without family consequences. It's not without psychological consequences. And it's not without you adopting ways of reacting and behaving that at the time make perfect sense and are the absolute thing that keeps you alive. Yet when you come back and you now are trying to coach a soccer game. You know, those are probably not the same reactions and skills that you want. Kind of like me today with my team, where probably my reaction there was a great combat operations officer reaction, not an appropriate reaction for a team that was trying to muddle their way through a PowerPoint slideshow. But
that's great.
I think the at least the funny thing to me is, like you said, as you go through several of these deployments, you start seeing the same people that are out there. They are pushing the limits, and they're pushing their own limits, and they are trying to do more and achieve more. And they also really kind of enjoy it. And then people look at them and go, didn't you see the guy shooting at you? Didn't you see the man pad come off the rail at you? Like, yeah, whatever. He missed, didn't he? And it's almost this cavalier attitude, which in hindsight, we all say that, we joke, we're in the debrief, and then we're back laying there and we're like, yeah, that guy did almost shoot me, and there's a moment of realization that I think we all went through, and you do a good job talking about it in Hangar 4, that you realize that isn't good, but it keeps me alive, so I'm going to keep doing it. So I'm going to keep enjoying it. I'm going to keep being this adrenaline fueled individual that is going to find the hard tasks, is going to adopt the difficult missions, is going to build a team that can do it. And I'll figure it all out later, which, as you bring up in the book, that's one of life's difficulties is at some point you come to the end of your career and you're like, I got to put all that stuff back in a box and do not touch. Don't go back to being that person.
Absolutely. And that was a really interesting journey to go through. But what you're saying is 100% right. And that was my experience. It was like, even when I got to the point that I started to say, recognize, like, this probably isn't good. This may not be great for you. I was so convinced that, like, that's who I needed to be to keep doing that job well and frankly stay alive, that there's no way in hell I was going to tinker with that formula. I just basically doubled, triple, quadruple down on it. It was like, hey, that's just how it's got to be until I'm done doing this. And then I'll figure it out, assuming I get
assuming I make it, we'll figure it out. Yeah.
Then I'll figure it out. Right. Until then, I'm just going to keep doing it this way because it works. It worked.
Well, and I think that was something that as a Marine Corps and Marine Corps aviation, we'll talk about now, is with the weapons and tactics instructors, we, at least in the Hornet community, we strove to find those people. Strove to find those people that were risk takers, but were highly skilled, people that knew the aircraft, they knew their tactics, but they weren't afraid to say, let's go figure it out. Let's come up with a creative solution. So let's talk a little bit about getting into the building. When you finished WTI and they invited you back to be an instructor, what were your thoughts? What were you thinking at that point?
My initial thought, I was like, wait, are they serious? Because
stop joking with me.
Because going through as a student, I just felt like it was really hard and the instructors were hard on us. And at that time, at least in the 53 community, the instructors weren't seen as, I don't even know how to say it, they weren't super welcome out in the fleet. And it was because they had basically a reputation as being these kind of jerk evaluator guys, not teachers and instructors. And I remember bringing that up as a concern when I was talking to them when I was getting recruited. And it was actually a great answer that I got back from one of the guys on staff. He's like, well, that's exactly why you should come here. You're right. We should do a better job of that. He's like, but we still have to be the best. I'm like, oh, okay, I got it.
That's another frightening, Whiskey and Eddie being very similar moment. Because when they invited me back, I was like, did you read the eval I wrote? Did you read what I said about you people? And literally, Major Palmer, Rosie, looks at me and goes, that's why we're inviting you back. It's your chance to fix it. And I'm like, oh, shit. All right. Got it.
Very, very similar conversation for me. It was like, well, if that's what you think, then go out there and be a great instructor and a teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Then you better be the best darn instructor when you get here. I'm like, okay, I guess that's how it's going to work.
Let's give it a shot.
Yeah. So I laughed because opening that chapter in the book, I mean, it took me back to see the names, to see Kramer, Dimes, all these people that I have these memories of just acting like a buffoon as we're sitting in the building talking about things at late at night, trying to put these crazy complex, WTI student evolutions together. And then, oh, by the way, you're not just doing that. You're doing Desert Talon, which is a fleet training exercise in the summers and in the winters. And the camaraderie that we had at MOTS 1, I think, is something that I've carried throughout my entire life, chasing it, really, to be honest, trying to get back to that very diverse group of people where everyone was at the top of their game, but also everybody was willing to go, you know what, I screwed that up. I need to learn better. You guys tell me, me as a jet guy, you helicopter guys, tell me what I should have said on the radio differently, what I should have planned differently, and make the whole of marine aviation better.
Yeah, it was amazing. And it was really just frankly, it was you guys, it was the other instructors that were there that made it amazing because everyone was so similar. Everyone was the best at what they did. Everyone was an expert, but everyone was still just like a really good dude. That was my observation.
That was absolutely.
There were certainly guys that were a little more cocky than others, and there was plenty of banter and shit talking that was going on, but everyone was really a good guy, and everyone worked well together. Everyone was willing to help each other with anything. So no matter what was happening, you just always felt like, hey, I got these 80 other people in this building that'll do anything they have to do to help make sure I don't screw this up, and we were all doing that for each other.
And that's I think the important point is we had built such a high morale amongst ourselves that we knew each other, we liked each other. Sure, there's times we got cross about something with another instructor. We're like, that guy's an idiot. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But overall, we really had this high camaraderie and morale that allowed us when things got stressful in WTI and when time got compressed and students couldn't figure out how to plan, we were always able to fall back on each other. And I know for me as a ground fac instructor, there were times that I would walk in to you guys as the assault support guys and go, I don't know what the load plan is, but it ain't working. One of y'all needs to go fix it.
Totally.
And I would do the same thing with my jet brothers. I'd be like, who planned this close air support? I'm like, did my student do that or did your student do that? And we'd all look at each other and go, okay, we'll fix it at 10 o'clock tonight when we throw all the students out. We'll sit around with a couple beers for another hour and we'll rewrite the plan.
That's funny. Yeah, it was awesome. I loved being in that building. I mean, that was truly, I think, probably the greatest organization I'll ever be a part of. Yeah, and that's certainly not to slight any other squadron or I've been in or any other company or anything. But I mean, just that organization, those 3 years was the best, hands down.
Well, and I'll tell a story specifically about Kramer because it's kind of funny.
Yeah.
But it is why you want to be in a very high morale organization with really people that trust each other and people that have everyone's best interest at heart and people that trust each other, but people that can also be perfectly honest about when they make mistakes. And you probably remember this landing out on the Eastern Ranges. We were out there and it was a huge package of 53s coming in. I want to say you had 8 aircraft at least coming in. And we're doing close air support, thankfully with inert weapons, so non-exploding bombs, just big chunks of concrete. But everything gets compressed, and we're trying to run airstrikes to suppress targets as you guys are coming in to pick us up. And at one point, the 53s are coming in, and I have cleared an F-18 hot on a target, and everything is safely deconflicted. No one's going to hit a 53 with a chunk of concrete, but everybody's flying right at each other. And I'm looking at my watch, and the student's late, and he didn't push on time, and that weapon's going to come off late. And I've cleared him hot already. And I'm just thinking, well, this is one fun way to end a career. So I think Kramer was in -2, or he's up in the front of the whole formation, and he sees the small smoke impact from the laser guided training round hitting the simulated anti-aircraft artillery. He's like, this is amazing. Eddie's out there killing the target. And we get back and I go, and Kramer's of course all excited. I'm like, bro, if that was a real bomb, pieces of frag would be coming through your rotor blades right about now. And he suddenly got very quiet. He's like, oh, so you're saying you screwed up? I'm like, oh yeah, I screwed up big on that one. I'm like, I owe you guys. But he knew that everything was safe, and in his mind, okay, it all looks cool. But for me, as the ground fac instructor, I'm like, no, we put you guys in a place where we shouldn't have put you. It was safe for training, but this is not how we execute in combat. But yeah, it was always fun to do things with you guys, and I have so many fond memories of 53s coming in and picking me up in all the ranges and doing all the assaults with you guys.
Yeah, it was a blast flying those flights out there. And, we do basically every mission set gets woven into the course somehow. So, just getting to do all the defensive measures with the different fixed wing platforms and fighting against the Hind and, not to mention just all your standard assault support stuff was so cool.
Yeah, I was glad you brought up the Hind and flying the Hind in there because that was always one of the fun things to see out on the range. You're just driving along in your, SUV as you're going out to whatever field activity, and there goes a Hind overhead, and it comes back around and runs a simulated airplane strafing run on you. You're like, oh, thanks.
I loved flying that thing, and somehow I got lucky. I got picked early. I think my first year to go do it the first time. So after that, I kind of knew what I was. I knew enough to be dangerous. But you go out there, this 7,000-hour Army warrant officer who's actually flying it. He'd put us in the front seat, and every time he'd hand you a grease pencil and be like, "Okay, here's your mark for 100 knots. Here's 100 feet." Like you're basically, because all the gauges are in Russian, you can read them. So you just make a couple of grease pencil marks for some basic reference points, and away we go. And, he would get it started up and then be like, "Okay, you got it," and be like, "All right, awesome. Here we go. Go
Let's
fly
go.
that thing." And you studied the profile, so you knew how to fly the profile to give the students the look. But I loved doing that. It was a blast.
Yeah, it was always good to have that airplane out on the range and doing that. Well, let's talk about some of those missions. So we talked a little bit before we started. One of my things that always frustrates me is people don't understand how complex assault support is. To them, it's just picking up packs, mail, and cargo and taking it around the battlefield. But there's at least two missions that I always enjoyed as a ground forward air controller or as an airborne forward air controller, working with the assault support community, specifically the 53s, was one, TRAP, Tactical Recovery of Aircraft and Personnel, which you talk about in the book, and NEOs, Non-Combatant Evacuation Operations. Those two were my favorites. It was always fun to do a battalion assault, run up the hill, yut, bayonet the bad guys that are on top of the hill. But those weren't as demanding of missions or as complex of missions. So let's talk a little bit about TRAP, and specifically about TRAP in the book as you talk about it. For most of us, TRAP is going out and leaving a burned aircraft somewhere and picking up the aviators out of it and bringing them back and then like blowing up the wreckage. No, for you, TRAP was picking up a whole damn airplane. So let's talk a little bit about that. How did you end up recovering the vast majority of a CH-47?
Oh, man.
Or an MH-47, I should say.
Definitely my all-time favorite flight, my all-time favorite mission. And thankfully, I was at a point in my career where I was prepared to do it because it was that damn hard. This was post my time as a MOS 1 instructor back in the fleet as a major, probably, frankly, peaking as an aviator right at that time, which was helpful. But, we're in Afghanistan, we're operating, get a call from higher headquarters. There's an Army, 47 down out near the Pakistani border. So I do some initial information was very basic, but it was just enough to get me started on the math problem, because it really was a math problem initially. Was, can we pick this thing up if, assuming we can even get to it? So my quick swag said, yeah, probably, if we can get 5,000 pounds stripped off of our own aircraft, which I had our maintenance guys working on simultaneously. But basically this planning evolves over the course of the night. As more information becomes available, you realize, okay, this not only is this an Army 47, but it belongs to the Night Stalkers. It's one of those 47s.
Those guys.
So whatever they were doing when they rolled it over was super dangerous. And the zone is obviously terrible because they rolled it over. And, they've got gear on those aircraft to help them land and reduce visibility. We don't have any of that.
They're not boot aviators either. These are, and you allude to, there's guys we knew that had been Marine aviators that then went and flew for the Night Stalkers. And they're not rookies. So if they rolled it over, it's a shitty LZ.
Yeah, they've got a whole team of just rock stars. It's like, the Night Stalkers is like a squadron full of WTIs, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
And pretty senior ones. So we're like, okay, we're going to get into this. But we ended up, had to do a full brief to our commanding general. He didn't like it for a bunch of reasons. I didn't think we were going to end up getting to go. But then a couple layers above him, though, for all commander forces, was like, no, you guys go give it a shot. Which I was ecstatic about. I wanted to go give it a shot. But we ended up, to make it all work, we had to have our ox tanks to make the flight out there, because it was a pretty long flight from where we started at Bastion. And then when we got to this little staging area, forward operating base, our maintainers were removing my auxiliary tanks as I'm doing a quick objective area brief with these Army Apache pilots about how we're going to go in and out of the objective area. Then run back out to my aircraft, fire it back up, take off, no ox tanks. And we literally set it up to do the external lift right at sunrise, because it's the coldest time of the day. So it's going to give us our best shot. And then, I'll never forget landing behind that aircraft and sitting there for a few minutes before we picked up to try to grab it, just looking at it and think like, damn, that thing looks big. I was like,
did you have that moment where you're like, I might have gotten myself in over my head?
Yeah, I'm sitting in the CH-53, which is pretty damn big, looking at that thing, thinking like, it's about as big as we are. I don't know if this is my best idea.
I think we've all had that moment in our career where we're like, did I say that this was a good idea? Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got to carry this through to conclusion. I got to try.
Yep.
But
got to give it a shot. So we ended up doing it, and through a little bit of luck and some things going right, we got it up off the ground and got it out of there. And it was definitely an awesome moment as an aviator to just have the opportunity to do it, and the fact that we pulled it off. And it really changed the course of our whole deployment when we did that, because it was early in the deployment. We pulled that off. It went well. But what was happening in theater at the time is the Night Stalkers, like always, were very popular with all the special operations units.
Right.
And after that, they realized like, oh, hey, there's this 53 squadron over here that they kind of know what's going on. They're not total knuckleheads.
They don't totally suck. Let's go talk to those guys.
And so they started basically pushing all of their overflow missions down to the wing to hand to us. So we ended up getting to do a bunch of neat, tactical missions we otherwise probably wouldn't have gotten the ability to do. And so in that deployment, it was really, I thought, incredible that it worked out this way, but we ended up doing 144 named operations, which was a pretty insane pace for an assault support squadron.
Yeah.
To do that, it got to where we were literally doing one almost every night. And thankfully, we had the crews that were deep enough to do it. I think all together, we had like 6 WTIs in the squadron, which is pretty unusual. It was like twice as many as you normally have. Yep. But because of that, as the OPSO, I was able to just rotate everybody. So, a couple guys were out doing the one tonight, and a couple guys are planning the one for tomorrow, and just kept the trains rolling, and it worked well.
Well, you guys did such a good job that you did yet another one later in that deployment, right? You grabbed a Canadian one. So it wasn't enough to lift one 47. Yeah. You had to go get a second one, which I laugh because when I was in Bastion the year before you, another 47 had gone down and they'd asked, can you do it? And we all looked at it, and based on the time of day and the year and everything, we're like, there's no way. We cannot strip enough off our airplanes and off that airplane unless we cut it in half to get it out of there. So I was glad that you guys got it. I felt bad for our guys. I'm like, sorry, we didn't get to do the mission. They did. But to me, it makes a really important point that part of it is having a squadron that's tight enough to even attempt something like that, and to even say, hey, sir, we're gonna get your aircraft to the best position we can so that you can give it your best shot. And then when people see you go out there and give it your best shot, and whether you make it or not, the fact is all those Marines say those crews gave it their best shot. In this case, they did. That just kicks morale up to another level.
It did. And in our case, it was really fortunate because the Marine Corps was doing something really unusual at the time with the 53 squadrons, and that we were taking half a squadron from the West Coast, half a squadron from the East Coast, mashing us together for deployment. And both of those units, in my opinion, were strong going into that. But I wrote this in the book really honestly, but that mashing together those two halves of the squadron, that was really hard. And it was really hard. And there was a lot of natural conflict that was coming up, and a whole bunch of like, East Coast, West Coast.
Yep.
I mean,
I laughed as you read it. I'm like, what kind of dirty names are you calling me as an East Coast Marine? But they're all true. It's all the difference in perspectives. And even I've had it where we composited 2 East Coast squadrons, and they're still, we were a single seat squadron composited with a 2-seat squadron. You want to talk about some stupid personality conflicts, but you got them because guys have their ways of doing things.
And even I would say, and I tried to write this honestly, but smartly, like for myself and the squadron CO that came from the East Coast, both great backgrounds, and I love the guys. A human being is great, but I was very honest about how difficult it was just for me and him to like look at the world the same way initially, you know. And the funniest part about it, I would say, is we both probably really personified our respective coasts. Like I was the quintessential West Coast aviator, and he was the quintessential East Coast even Marine, not even aviator, right? Like, and those are two very
so he had his braided belt and his collared shirt.
Those are just two,
wearing his slacks on Liberty.
Two very different human beings that are trying to do the exact same thing, but in some ways just kind of looking at it different, going about it different. And I thought that, I look back on that myself personally is like one of the like coolest leadership things I was ever part of, how that came together. But making it come together initially was really damn hard.
Oh yeah.
And I felt fortunate that we got handed that trap mission, because that execution of that was when it all felt possible, at least for me. Like up until that point, it was like, oh man, this is like a terrible arranged marriage, and this is not good. But then we kind of all came out on the same page, because we had this one big thing to rally around, pulled it off, and then from there, everything was easy.
Yeah, I think there's a leadership lesson there a lot of times that people forget. You can have the same goals, you can both be from the same, service and everything, but you're going to look at things differently. And as a result, you're really going to nitpick things that don't matter. And you have to step back and say, I'm going to get angry about things that matter, things that don't matter, whatever, their personal ways of doing things, their preferences, each brand or each coast of the Marine Corps, and then obviously Iwakuni and Okinawa have very different cultures, and they generate very different individuals over time. So it's just funny that you have to at some point step back and go, you know what? They're doing their level best to make the best squadron. We're going to do our best, and we're going to try to
absolutely
find that middle road.
And again, on not letting myself add any revisionist history, I can see very clearly now, like, I was kind of a pain in the ass. Like I really was. Like I was
nothing less whiskey.
I was definitely part of the problem at times, and it's obvious now, but at the time, it's just you're so proud of like who you are and who your squadron is, and you're like, we do it this way. No, we do it this way. And even though the differences are just these tiny little minor nuances that really don't matter, it's easy to get kind of hung up in that stuff.
Yeah, you get super hung up, because I found myself, shortly after I'd finished WTI, going back and being the training officer on a combined single seat, 2-seat dead in Australia. And literally the single seat squadron did everything different. And it wasn't that they were doing things not good. They just, if there was a point where the NATOP said do A or B, they would do B. We as an East Coast squadron would do A. And it was the most infuriating thing. And that's where I learned that same lesson where, okay, I'm going to concentrate on safety of flight things. I'm going to concentrate on, safe tactical employment. If they want to take off and waggle their wings to tell them to join up, whatever, I don't care. Cool. Great. Awesome. I may think that's the dumbest thing they do possible, but got it. That you're the flight lead, do what you want,
That's funny.
Yeah. It's just interesting how the Marine Corps works that way. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, and there's a lot more you could talk about trap. I mean,
for sure.
You and I could tell sea stories about training trap missions and all kinds of crazy stuff you do for long range trap and stuff like that. But I do want to take some time to talk about the other mission really near and dear to my heart, the Neo, because the Neo is such a complex. I don't know. I don't even want to call it an operation. Since this is an E-rated podcast, I can say it. A Neo is a clusterfuck waiting to happen. and it's a clusterfuck you walk through and you're like, am I finally done? Did we get everyone out? Okay, good. Fuck, we're done.
It is.
So it's one of those things you walk away from and you finally can wash your hands. You're like, all right, we got everyone out that we were supposed to get. But I think in the book you really talk about the complexity of it, but the way you talk about it is having to brief the city council. And a lot of people don't think about that as Marines, we didn't go out to a range somewhere out in the open desert and practice this Neo. Yeah. No, we put CH-53s, we put 46s, we put people into Yuma, Arizona, into Brawley, California, landed in cities and took out hundreds of role players and flew them back to MCAS Yuma or El Centro.
We did.
How did we do that? And I'm going to ask you because you were the guy that had to brief it all. How did we do that?
It was super complicated. And I remember I got handed that major evolution my first year. It was at the halfway point of my first year. So my second class, I'm in charge of the Neo. And I was like, you gotta be shitting me. This is I was really intimidated. I'm not going to lie. I was like, this is a huge thing. We're going to be in town. Oh my God, I can't screw this up. So like anything else, just dive into it. Feel like, okay, I've got to get a handle on it. But you put to, and WTI is tricky as a MOTS instructor because you're not just planning and executing, you're building a plan for someone else to plan and execute, hopefully the exact way you've designed that you think they will or want them to or need them
you're
to.
building the rails that you really hope they stay between, but they're an independent thinking human being. Like, no, we're going to go do this over here. You're like, you really can't do that. City council didn't approve you to put 453s in the zone at the same time.
Absolutely. So you put this whole huge plan together, but getting this buy-in from the city was critical. But also, in typical Mods 1 fashion, we wanted to do it as real as it could possibly be, and doing it in the city was the only way.
Seemed like
to
a
make
good
it that
idea.
real. Yeah. And so coming up with all of the flight safety stuff and corridors and how are we going to block these landing zones off and make sure no civilians are roaming around in there, all of that stuff goes into it. But then, we went the extra mile and talked to the Department of State, got real consular affairs officers to come out and made sure that we had all the players that would be involved if we were really doing this in any country on the planet for real. And so it's just this great evolution, but it is extremely complicated. And just keeping track of the head count once you start to execute it is in of itself like a helmet fire for almost everyone involved, right? Like every radio call, every stick that's reported, all of those things are getting recorded on this master tracker back somewhere. But every player involved in this thing is tracking the same information, hopefully to the T. And seeing that play out, especially for the students in a training environment, was always an interesting adventure.
Yeah.
At the end of the night to be like, how many do you think you pulled out?
Yeah, exactly. Did we actually get? Well, and that's a huge lesson for people that don't understand NEOs is the fog and the confusion, even for you and I as instructors, that we knew what the numbers were supposed to be.
Yeah.
I remember being a forward air controller instructor in the landing zone in Brawley, California, in the heat and all the fuel fumes off the aircraft and the noise and everything, not being able to do math and just sitting there going, I got to keep the count straight because I can't let my student be the only player here. I've got to be the backstop, and like trying to count on my fingers at some point of how many sticks of evacuees have we sent out? What is the actual count?
Absolutely.
And it's pure chaos. And I think, like we talked about before we started the podcast, not to go into political things, but I think people forget every NEO is some level of chaos. Some of them go smoother than others, but every NEO has a level of chaos that's difficult to get your arms around. It isn't just an administrative loading of personnel. It's, prioritization of people. And I can never remember exactly who gave me this way of looking at it. I think it was the MUSOC evaluators on the East Coast when I did my MU float, but they broke it down very straightforward. They're like, you get all the VIPs out, no questions asked. That happens. You don't leave the ambassador behind. You get out as many American citizens and others that you can. And if you get to shoot any bad guys, that's gravy. That's not why you're there. You're there to evacuate all these non-combatants. So don't go in there, F-18 guy, forward air controller, and think you're going to be running gun runs. It's not going to happen that way. So I think for me, it was an eye opener to have done it a couple times as a forward air controller when I was with a battalion, and then to do it a bunch of times in training as a MOTS 1 IP, and to sit there and see just how quickly things can degenerate, even when you're not fighting an enemy, even when it's just purely people pushing to get on an airplane and the ambassador's wife has brought her fluffy little dog and, all of those things that get in your loop that tell you it's not an admin load. What were some of the things that you remember putting in as the scenario?
Oh my gosh.
The evolution coordinator.
I remember sitting back in the spaces with the other IPs and just guys brainstorming, like, what kind of weird thing can we put into the scenario? It's like injured people with weird pets, of course, people making demands that are impossible to meet, the super angry older lady that's demanding something you can't possibly do.
Yep.
And so it was always fun to get the role players together beforehand and be like, okay, I need someone to be this guy. And then, of course, we'd always get some Marines to do that. And they loved it.
Yep.
So that was hilarious. And they get to go on a free helicopter ride. So
exactly.
It was fun.
I think one of my favorite ones was always the non-cooperative evacuees that would that you literally would look at them and go, your entire goal is be safe, but run around the LZ and act like you're going crazy, and watching the Marines have to then tackle them, flex cuff them, put them on the airplane and get them out of there. And you're just laughing. You're like, I can't believe we're having this much fun doing this, but you see the stress it's inducing in all the people that are trained trying to do the evacuation. So
it was super fun.
It was. I really enjoyed doing those operations. But, you brought up a good point, and I hadn't thought about talking about this, is how quickly the building of MOTS 1, that organization, throws responsibility at young instructors.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember I had probably been there, I think, a year. Actually, I'd been there 6 months before I'd done one WTI. One of the Huey instructors, who was the forward air controller for the entire final exercise, walked in, looked at me, and goes, "Eddie, I want you to be my replacement." And I'm like, dude, I'm barely figuring this building out. I don't even know who those people over in the stinky helicopter division are, and now you're telling me I have to be the lead instructor for the final exercise for, 2 to 3 days of helicopter assaults, all this other stuff as a forward air controller. And he goes, "Yeah, you can do it. I've seen you execute." And it's that moment where you as an IP go, I got to figure this out. I can't do it all myself.
Yeah.
I got to rely on this group of other really capable people, and I got to trust them. And I got to look at them and go, you've got a couple weeks before the students show up. Go figure it out. Do your planning. Come back. Let's make a plan that we're not going to get yelled at by the colonel and by the generals. So it was great. Yeah. It was great for me to get trusted with that much responsibility. But yeah, like you said, it's sobering. You're like, oh, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong here.
It is.
And
It is. And then going, just for me, taking the commanding officer to go brief the city council in 2 different cities. And, they're not big towns, but still you're driving the man in the government Suburban to go give your brief, hoping you don't screw any of that up. Like it was an interesting experience, but you grow up pretty fast doing that sort of thing, I think. And
I think you do.
It's something that helped me so much later, because you do it because it's expected and you rise to the occasion and you do it. But then you realize in the process, like, oh, this really wasn't that hard. That wasn't that big of a deal. And then you get very comfortable. At this point, I probably stand up and talk in front of just about anybody without giving it too much thought, which is good. It's helpful.
It's a good skill to have. And I think that's something that also we forget that makes our squadron so effective, is when you get MOTS instructors back in the fleet and they've been executing at this high level. Yeah, it's tough for us to sometimes step back to a regular squadron full of regular people that make regular mistakes, but then still go, you know what? It isn't that hard. All it takes is some planning. All it takes is all of us giving our level best effort at it. And I think, especially talking about the trap, that was the lesson I took from reading that in your book. And I'm glad you referenced, having the guts to try. Yeah. Because that's also one of my favorite books that's up there. Is that's one of those things of just do it. Just put your best information together, build the best team you can, and give it your best shot. And you will fail sometimes. There's going to be times you're not going to make it.
And that is how I felt about that trap in the wake of it, because there were multiple points where we could have said no, we could have stopped, we could have tapped out. I mean, I felt like our commanding general was almost asking me to do that beforehand.
Yeah,
like, hey, it's okay if you don't do it. And I was like, why are you telling me this? Of course I'm doing it.
Like, of course I'm doing it. Yeah. Why wouldn't I?
Yeah. What are you? Yeah. Are you crazy? This is happening. But I understood why he was saying it. I understand even more now, but it was just one of those things. I felt like, hey, let's give it a shot.
Yeah. I think we create people from marine aviation, and especially amongst WTIs, that it's not that we think we're bulletproof, but in a sense, we're too dumb to be scared. We're like, you know what? It's another planning problem. I just need to plan my way through it. And that's a coping mechanism. That's something we've learned on how to compartmentalize, that if all I have to worry about is the number of airplanes, the amount of gas, the number of landing points, if that's all I worry about, then I'm not going to have the rest of the emotional baggage of there's like 17 different ways I can crash and kill myself in this operation. So
absolutely.
I think that's one of our compensating techniques and for compartmentalization that really makes us so successful. And that's always the funny thing to read through the book and to see you walk through that, where you talk about that, where you talk about all I was concerned about was not hitting the wall at the end of the landing zone. All I was concerned about was pivoting and getting, out of the way of the compound to my west, all those kind of things drove home how much in aviation you do compartmentalize. And I was thinking about, during my workout tonight, and I realized, I was like, what happened to me after the end of those missions? Because you don't think about how you decompress. And obviously you've thought about, because you had to write the book and you've had to sit there and say, yeah, I remember, feeling human after the fact. And I thought about it and I was like, I remember in my mind, the last moment I had to decompress and think about everything before I had to put the game face back on was when we would pull into the line and shut down. I had a few moments while the canopy's up, I'm putting my stuff back in the bag, and I have a moment to go, holy crap. But for me, I had to put the game face back on because when I stepped down off that ladder on that F-18, me and my pilot were meeting a plane captain who's happy to have an airplane back. We brought him his airplane back in one piece. But everybody wants to know how the mission is gone, and they want to hear all the good stuff. They don't want to hear, holy crap, I nearly killed myself on this strafing run in our case, or holy crap, we did something really dumb releasing our weapon below the min out. That's not what they want to hear. You put the game face back on, you're like, absolutely, this was awesome. Thanks for all the help. Great airplane. Here's what we need to work on. Let's go fix this, and let's go back out and do it again in 12 hours. It's an interesting morale point especially for you talking as a commanding officer. I felt there was a lot of that, whereas put it back in the box.
Yep.
And get the unit going back forward.
Yeah, for sure. I got very adept at that. But I will tell you, one of the things that I just for myself that I did, and I'm a nerd for doing it, but I'm thankful that I did, was keeping a journal. So that was like my decompression exercise. The last thing I do before I go to sleep at whatever time on the 24-hour spectrum was my nighttime then.
Exactly.
Was I'd take always a few minutes at least and just jot down like, hey, here's what we did. Especially for the flights, I was really good at capturing those, especially on deployment. And that was kind of my decompression exercise. But as soon as I was done with that, it was like got filed and I didn't think about it again. And I really didn't for many years until I sat down to do this project. And that was the first time in for like a long time that I went back through that journal. I was like, oh, wow, forgot about that. Like, there's no way I could have written this without that journal. I mean, that was really the base document. That's where I data mined everything because I'd had it.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I really enjoyed reading through it. So it's a lot of fun to read, someone's parallel journey through the Marine Corps and see the things that are similar and the things that are different. And we had a lot of different experiences, obviously being between two very different aircraft, different kind of squadrons, different deployments. I mean, you talked about OIF was your first combat, and for me, that was the third check in the block. I was the old salty captain that I like to think I was, which I really wasn't. But, between having done Allied Force, Operation Allied Force, and then doing Enduring Freedom as a FAC, I was walking into that one, and it was totally different stressors rather than the first combat stressors. It was the, oh crap, how do I convince all of my wingmen who can't even touch the right end of the airplane? How do I bring them back? So it's always fun to read those differences, and I think it's a great book specifically for bringing the human element in, because you do a good job, and I'm glad you didn't edit the language. I'm glad you kept all the fucks in there because that's how we talk and that's how we think. And that's why I have an E-rated podcast, because I can't not drop an F-bomb. But I thought there was a great job just bringing someone through and what the feeling of the moment was. You didn't have to necessarily tell the full sea story, but you walked them through all the considerations of the mission, the emotional factors of the mission, and then how that affected you over time, because it is baggage, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. And it was important to me to include those things. Like, it would have been easy to just say, this is what happened, tell the mission story and leave all that other stuff out. But I actually thought, especially because I had it in a journal, that if I was able to do that well, it might be interesting to people to see not only what I was thinking, feeling, how it was affecting me, but how that was happening over the course of several years and multiple deployments, and watching that, smart ass young captain turn into this probably way too overconfident senior captain, turns into a major who hates himself because he hates majors. Now he's the CEO of the damn squadron. Like, you get to see that whole arc of that, human being just evolving through this experience and having those moments, towards the tail end where you're like, how am I still doing this? Like, I have to be crazy. Like, this just doesn't, this doesn't make any damn sense. But that just all those light bulbs coming on and becoming more aware over time of what's happening and how you think it's affecting you, but you're not sure. It's a fascinating experience, I think. And I would certainly do it all over again, but I just thought it might be interesting to present it that way, in a really open and honest way.
Well, and I think that's good, because we've talked a lot in the podcast about when you read something historical, the first kind of history that a lot of times you throw away is someone's got an agenda. They want to paint the history their way. But then the good thing is a lot of times you get the history from someone's very narrow perspective, and especially if they admit that narrow perspective, that is super helpful in reading the book and reading it for the historical part of it and saying, I know about Operation Matador. I know about a bunch of these things that went on. It's good that Whiskey says, here's what he remembers. And this was his focus, because the stories I heard were totally different things. And so it's a fascinating way for me as an amateur historian to say, oh, here's a lot I didn't know about assault support operations over the very same conflicts I was in. I mean, you and I were in OIF-1 at the same time together. Our other deployments mixed and mashed. You were in Afghanistan a year after I was. So we were all in the same areas, but it's just funny when you get someone else's perspective of the history and what was going on. And
I did think it was important to do that too. So I didn't add essentially any additional information. Like whatever's in there is whatever that's however much situational awareness I had at the time. So
which by the way, thank you, because there is a thing that I hate about some historical, biographical writing, that they have to tell me all the phases of the operation, and I'm like, I'm not reading this to learn about this operation. I'm reading this for someone's account of what they did. So thank you for not building the watch, even though you're a WTI. Kind of surprised you didn't do that. But thanks for skipping a lot of that detail, and I think that may be jarring to some people who are used to that kind of biography, where really people would explain the entire operational significance of something. That's not the focus of this book. The focus of this book is your journey over your military career, and the personality changes and perception changes. The things that were important early on that you get to later in your career and you go, that's not so important, because one day I'm leaving the Green Gun Club and I need to have this family around me. I need to not run the family away. I need them to still like me.
Absolutely.
So
I think it was fun to put it together that way. Like I'm happy with how it came out, but it was challenging to kind of stick to my guns on those things. Those are things I decided at the very beginning of the project, but just making myself stay true to that. It was hard. It was challenging, because there were certainly times, especially with like what you're just talking about, where I naturally wanted to start expounding on the bigger picture of what was happening in the theater. And I'm like, okay, stop. You didn't know any of that shit then, so there's no point talking about it.
All we cared about at that point was like, when is my brief? When is the chow hall open, and how many hours of sleep can I get? That's all we cared about.
Your focus was this big, so that's the focus you get to keep here, because that's reality.
Which is hilarious, because you're talking about stuff going on at Jalaba that I had no idea went on. I'm like, there's a FARP there, whatever. Okay, big deal. And it's so funny, because I'm like, as you're talking about these things, I was comparing my dates, and I'm like, oh, I know what my focus was. I was doing stuff up at Baghdad or all the way up north into Crit and all this other stuff. I'm like, no wonder, I'm not thinking and seeing the same things, because I'm not even fighting in the same part of the battle space that Whiskey's in. My F-18 missions are elsewhere. So
that's really cool.
I really enjoyed the book. I did also enjoy, a lot of the way you brought out the combat addict, and you pretty much say that at the end. You talk about the fact that you have to change who you are coming back in. And you made it a very real personal story. So thank you for doing that, because a lot of what I read, especially a few years prior, has been very much rah, we're all great. Being in the military was awesome. And it's not the story of, that was cool, but now I gotta decompress. I gotta become a civilian again. I'll always be a Marine, but I gotta put that in a box. And we've seen it a lot of our peers sometimes don't always do that very well. And I think for all of us, it's always a struggle.
It is.
That's something to think about.
It is hard. And I do think, honestly, that was one of my motivators in the end, because really for a while I was walking around with this idea for this book and kept telling myself, like, look, you're an assault support pilot. No one cares. What are you thinking?
Who cares about what you do?
Give me a break. They write books about 53 pilots. But then over time, that became like kind of one of my first reasons to do it was like, well, I was in all these squadrons. I know what the 53s did over the course of these wars. Like, maybe if I do this, it'll at least capture a piece of that history from the perspective of someone who was there. And then the next piece that I kind of landed on was just what you were talking about. I knew a lot of guys, friends, and some just acquaintances, but guys I'd served with that were having a hard time for whatever reason. And I felt like I knew what's bothering them. And I kind of just landed on this conclusion, like, well, maybe if I share this story in like a very honest way, that might be in some way helpful to people like that. If nothing else, just to go, oh, there's one other guy who's as crazy as I am, or
Exactly.
or whatever, and is helpful in some way to acknowledge that. So that's why I included all those things.
Well, I think there's a progression through the book that's important, and I'll bring up one of the toughest parts for me is reading about people that I knew that died either in combat or just in aviation mishaps, and
Absolutely.
it's putting all that in perspective, and I know that's always tough for a lot of us, especially for guys like Bull Bedraco, who was a very good friend of ours that you talk about in the book, that was a Cobra pilot who died in a training mishap. Otis Rabel, who was obviously the commanding officer of the Harrier Squadron, killed at Bastion with the insurgent attack there. But putting that in the perspective of, as Marines, we didn't have really time to grieve at that point. We didn't have, we were busy either redeploying, getting ready to deploy, in combat somewhere else, doing all these operations, or even just on a training deployment overseas, fulfilling national objectives. We didn't have time to really grieve, and I was glad you brought that up. That it's something you really unpack later. And I know specifically in the case of those two guys. I mean, obviously we've lost a lot of friends over our 20-year careers. But those were guys that we at MOTS 1 were super close with. And they were guys that we spent a lot of time with. We planned with, we drank beers with, we executed at a very high level with. And it probably wasn't until, I want to say 4 years after I retired, that it was the first time I could sit back and think about those two and let myself take it out of the box. And let myself really say, oh, man, I miss those guys, and really grieve for them, something that I just didn't have time to do, all the way through my Marine Corps career.
Well, and also I think those two were really difficult because at that point in my career, especially, I'd kind of convinced myself like, okay, you are proficient enough at this that you've got a decent chance of pulling all this shit off.
You're bulletproof.
And so when the other guys who are your peers, when it happens to them, it was like always very sobering because it's like, no, you're never really safe. Like, or you're never really so proficient that this can't happen.
That this can't happen.
It can still get your ass. I mean,
exactly.
And that 2-second acknowledgement was sobering, but then you'd have to take that and immediately like, ooh, box that sucker up and bury it because I've got stuff I have to keep doing right now.
Yeah.
You know?
And I remember, and this is going to sound bizarre except for people like us, I remember when Otis was killed, and he's killed leading the defense of his squadron in Bastion. For all of us as Marine officers, there's a moment where you're like, you fucker, you got to go out the way we all wanted to go out. You're like, how the fuck did that happen? And then there's this moment where you're like, well, shit, how did the Marines get attacked? There's this whole weird mix of emotions where you're like, yeah, the Marines kicked ass, but how did 15 insurgents get through the wire? But I'm damn proud of, squadron maintenance Marines taking the fight to them, and it's this bizarre, I'm not sure I've even unpacked it yet in my life, but it's this bizarre mix of emotions where you're upset that it happened, you're grieving for your friends that died, but at the same time, you're like, really super proud of the squadron for doing the things they did, and for the Skid Squadron getting airborne and providing close air support and all those things. Yeah.
I mean, it's an insane story. And I remember, that was, I think just a year after I had been there, and go out running on that flight line or along that fence line at night, and always kind of thinking to myself, like, it's really weird. It's pretty dark out here. I'm thinking one of these towers, nothing but a chain link fence between me and the Taliban. Like, this might not be too smart, but you just did it. But then once that happened, it was like, oh shit, of course that happened.
Yeah. and there's so many things like that in hindsight that are so crystal clear. Yeah. And I try to convince people, when we get angry, when Marines lose their lives, when combat operations don't go the way we think they should have, I remind people who haven't been there and haven't had the fog of war. And there's moments where you're like, I have no idea what's going on. I just know I need to shoot that way. I'm just going to keep shooting that way, and everybody else figure it out. That it is so difficult to know exactly what you should do, and you so fall back on training. And it's the same thing in aviation. I even remember at WTI as an instructor, there were times that in the pit of my stomach, the mission I was doing, a night close air support with troops on the ground with live ordnance, I felt super uncomfortable, but I knew if I did what I was trained to do, if I executed per the procedures, everything would be okay.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
it's an interesting compartmentalization.
It is. But I'm thankful that I've at least unpacked some of that in some way. And the time I've been out of the Marine Corps, I have like semi-normal human emotions again now. Sometimes it's good. But it's nice
I don't know that I do. I'm glad you're ahead of me. I read the book and I'm like, shit. As always, Whiskey's so much a better person than me. I'm like, I am not that person. I laughed after when I got the book and Michelle, my wife, looked over. She's like, I was going to buy you that for your birthday. I'm like, okay. And also don't read the book because then you're going to realize what a good person Whiskey is. And you'd be like, why aren't you like our neighbor Whiskey, who's a good person? I'd be like, well, he's more introspective than I am.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's been good. It's a journey. It's a work in progress for sure.
It is. And I really appreciate you sharing it in the book. And I definitely appreciate you taking the time. It's always good to chat and catch up.
This was a blast. Absolutely. It went by too fast. And sorry, I wasn't thinking about the fact that it got dark while I was sitting here. So it looks like I'm on The Godfather or something.
Yeah, that's fine. I was laughing like, see, I don't have to blank out the background automatically. It did all that.
It's like, I should have turned a lamp on before it got dark. Sorry.
Yeah, whatever. I have the blazing lights on in here. So everyone's like, why doesn't he just take some of that glare off? Oh, yeah. But no, thanks. So everyone can find your book either at isaacglee.com, something like that.
isaacglee.com. That's the easiest place. There's links there to go to Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. Warwick's here in San Diego has it. They'll ship it as well. Those are the easiest places to get it. And then we've got events going on a few different places. So been out doing some signings, have a couple more coming up on the East Coast, and it's been really fun. It's been an enjoyable experience. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're doing it, and I'm glad, rather than being sarcastic and finishing on our usual sarcastic note, I will steal a little bit of the thunder from your book and say that the thing that I took away is you never know what you can do and how hard you can push until you have the guts to try.
Yeah,
and thanks for bringing that out of the book. I really appreciate it.
Hey, of course. Thank you. It's great talking to you again. I appreciate it.
It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, take care.